Joseph was thrown into a pit by his own brothers. Moses spent 40 years talking to sheep in a desert. David hid in caves running from a king who wanted him dead. Paul was struck blind and left alone. Job lost everything in a single day. These are not stories of men God forgot. These are the personal files of the men God was most serious about. And the pattern inside those files will change the way you see everything that is happening to you right now. Because God does not break the ones He has abandoned. He breaks the ones He has chosen. And the depth of the breaking is the exact measure of the greatness He is preparing. Before we look at these 5 men, you need to understand something about how God builds. Because the way God constructs a life is not the way the world constructs a career. The world builds from the outside in. Credentials first. Confidence first. Comfort first. Then character. But God builds from the inside out. Character first. Capacity first. Surrender first. Then the platform. And the only tool that builds those things deep enough to carry the weight of what God is preparing, is breaking. Not discouragement. Not punishment. Breaking. The deliberate, surgical removal of everything in a man that would destroy him if the greatness arrived too soon. This is the part of Scripture most preachers skip. We celebrate the palace and skip the pit. We preach the throne and skip the cave. We quote the restoration and skip the ash heap. But the pit, the cave, and the ash heap are not interruptions to the story. They are the story. They are where God does what comfort never could. The first man. Joseph. The pit before the palace. Genesis 37 verse 28. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 pieces of silver. He was 17 years old. He had a dream from God. He had a father who loved him. He had a coat that set him apart. And in a single afternoon, his brothers stripped the coat, threw him in a hole, and sold him to strangers while they sat down to eat bread. Read that again. They sat down to eat bread. While their brother was in the pit. While his voice was still echoing off the walls of that cistern, they had a meal. This is where most believers would have concluded that the dream was a lie. That God had made a promise He had no intention of keeping. That the coat meant nothing and the dream was nothing and the Father's love was not enough to protect you from the people closest to you. Joseph had every reason to build a wall around his heart that would never come down. Every reason to trade the dream for survival. Every reason to let bitterness become his theology. But look at what the pit produced in Joseph. Genesis 39 verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph. Not after the pit. In the pit. Not after Potiphar's house. In Potiphar's house. Not after the prison. In the prison. The presence of God did not arrive when Joseph's circumstances improved. The presence of God was the one constant through every descent. And here is what the pit burned out of Joseph that the palace could never have removed. The need for human approval. The coat was gone. The father's voice was gone. The brother's validation was gone. Everything external that had defined him was stripped away in one afternoon. And what was left? The thing that survived the pit and the prison and the false accusation, was a man whose identity was so anchored in God that Pharaoh looked at him and said, Genesis 41 verse 38, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" 13 years between the dream and the throne. 13 years of descending before the ascending began. And not one of those years was wasted. Not one morning in that prison was an accident. God was not waiting for Joseph's circumstances to improve. God was waiting for Joseph's soul to become what the dream required. The second man. Moses. The desert before the burning bush. Here is a detail most people miss entirely. Moses did not go to the desert as a broken man. He went as a fugitive. Acts 7 verse 22 tells us Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. He was 40 years old, raised in Pharaoh's palace, trained in the most sophisticated civilization on earth. He had the education, the connections, the access, the platform. By every human measurement, Moses was ready. And Moses agreed. Acts 7 verse 25. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. Moses thought he was ready. God knew he wasn't. Stop. Let that land. Because this is the breaking that most high-capacity believers never see coming. Not the breaking that comes from failure. The breaking that comes from being genuinely gifted, genuinely called, genuinely positioned, and still not ready. Because the gifts were real. The calling was real. The passion was real. But underneath all of it was a man who still believed, in the deepest part of himself, that his Egyptian education was what qualified him. That his own strength was the instrument God would use. That the rescue of a nation ran through his ability rather than through his surrender. So God sent him to a desert for 40 years. Not 40 days. 40 years. To tend someone else's sheep. In obscurity. In silence. In the complete absence of everything that had previously defined him. And when the burning bush finally came, Moses was 80 years old. 40 years of palace preparation. 40 years of desert deconstruction. And only then, only when the man who thought he was ready had been completely emptied of that confidence, did God say, Exodus 3 verse 10, "So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people the Israelites out of Egypt." The desert did not waste 40 years of Moses' life. The desert produced the one thing the palace never could. A man who knew, without any doubt, that whatever happened in Egypt would have nothing to do with him. The third man. David. The cave before the crown. God anointed David king when David was still a shepherd boy. Samuel poured the oil on his head in front of his brothers. The Spirit of the Lord came on David in power from that day forward. And then, nothing happened. No palace. No army. No throne. Instead, David went back to his father's sheep. Then he killed a giant. Then he was brought into the palace, as a servant. Then the king tried to kill him. Then he ran. Then he hid. Then he lived in caves. This is 1 Samuel 22 verse 1. David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. The man anointed to be king was living in a cave. And who came to him there? Verse 2. All those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. God did not send David to the cave as punishment. God sent David to the cave as a classroom. Because a king who has never suffered cannot lead people who are suffering. A king who has never been hunted cannot protect people who are being hunted. A king who has never hidden in darkness cannot be trusted with the weight of a nation's light. David wrote Psalm 57 in that cave. "O God, have mercy on me, for people are hounding me. My enemies attack me all day long." He was not pretending the cave was comfortable. He was not manufacturing faith he didn't feel. He was crying out from the actual darkness of an actual hiding place. And the cry itself was the formation. Every psalm written in that cave was a stone being laid in the foundation of the throne that was coming. God was not delaying David's coronation. God was completing David's character. The fourth man. Paul. The blindness before the mission. Acts 9 verses 3 to 4. As Saul was approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And then verse 8. Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand into Damascus. And for 3 days he was blind and did not eat or drink anything. The man who would write 2/3 of the New Testament spent his first 3 days with Jesus completely blind, completely still, completely dependent on other people to lead him by the hand. The man whose letters would shape Christian theology for 2,000 years began his mission unable to see. The man whose encounter with Christ on that road was so violent it knocked him to the ground, started in darkness. Now ask yourself why. Paul had more natural qualification than almost anyone God ever used. Roman citizenship, Pharisaic training, intellectual brilliance, missionary zeal. He already had everything the mission required. Except one thing. The absolute, unambiguous, physically enforced knowledge that he could do nothing on his own. 3 days of blindness. 3 days of being led by the hand. 3 days of sitting in darkness with nothing but the voice of the God he had been persecuting. And when sight returned, it was not the same man who stood up. The man who stood up had been broken down to a single conviction that would hold for the rest of his life. Galatians 2 verse 20. I have been crucified with Christ and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. That sentence was written in those 3 days of blindness. The mission of a lifetime was built on the foundation of 3 days when Paul could not take a single step without someone leading him by the hand. The fifth man. Job. The ash heap before the restoration. Job 1 verses 2-3. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen and 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. And then in a single day, it was all gone. The livestock, the servants, the children. And then Job 2 verse 7. Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Job lost everything that had ever given his life definition. His wealth, his children, his health, his reputation. His wife told him to curse God and die. His friends told him he must have sinned to deserve this. And Job sat on an ash heap scraping his sores with a piece of broken pottery. This is not a metaphor. This is a man on the ground, in the dirt, with nothing left. And here is what the ash heap produced that prosperity never could. Job 42 verse 5. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Before the ash heap, Job knew about God. After the ash heap, Job knew God. That distinction, between knowing about and knowing, is the entire point of everything Job went through. The wealth was real. The family was real. The reputation was real. But none of it had produced in Job what the ash heap produced in a single season. A direct, unmediated, personal encounter with the living God that no amount of prosperity had ever generated. And Job 42 verse 12. The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the former part. Everything was restored. Doubled. The children, the livestock, the health, the years. But the man who received the restoration was not the same man who lost everything. The man who received it knew God's face. And that knowledge, bought on an ash heap, in the dirt, with a piece of broken pottery, was worth more than every blessing that followed. Now stop. Look at your own life. Look at the pit, the desert, the cave, the blindness, the ash heap you are currently sitting in or have recently survived. And ask a different question. Not why is this happening to me? But what is this producing in me that nothing else could? Because the pattern across these 5 men is not random. It is not coincidence that every man God used at the highest level went through a season of profound breaking first. The pit stripped Joseph of the need for human approval. The desert stripped Moses of confidence in his own strength. The cave gave David the capacity to lead broken people. The blindness gave Paul the unshakable knowledge of his own dependence. The ash heap gave Job the one thing all his prosperity never had, the face of God. What is your breaking removing from you that would have destroyed you if the greatness arrived too soon? What is your desert producing in you that the palace could never build? What is your cave teaching you about broken people that you will need when you are called to lead them? God does not break the ones he has abandoned. He breaks the ones he has chosen. And the evidence that you are being broken by God rather than crushed by the enemy is this: the presence of God does not leave in the breaking. It intensifies. Genesis 39 verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph. In the pit. In the prison. In the silence. Before anyone knew his name. You are not at the end of your story. You are in chapter 2. And chapter 2 is always where God does his most important work. Not in the palace. In the pit. Not on a throne. In the cave. Not in the restoration. On the ash heap. The breaking is not the interruption of the calling. The breaking is the qualification for it. Hold on. Your chapter 3 is being written right now in the very place you are most tempted to give up. Bible passage.